Delusion is ambitious. I don't know that I could name another example of a truly open-world indie game. Survival crafting games like Subnautica, sure, but a proper open-world RPG like this is, to my ears, unheard of. And in every aspect, from its highest highs to its lowest lows, I can only credit an abundance of ambition as the source. I'm going to have a lot of criticisms, but know that I highly recommend this game if that pitch interests you. Or if you enjoy the stories and worlds of classic PC RPGs, like Morrowind, or Fallout, or Arcanum. Or if you're a gay communist, or some such thing. If you need more than just my recommendation, then let's continue on. Delusion takes place 400 years after the World Rend, an apocalyptic event that left its planet flooded with a cursed miasma, unlivable to anything but monsters and machines, forcing humanity to escape to pagan sky islands up above in the atmosphere. And it also takes place 40 years after the God War, in which radical secularists wiped out every major god and religion on those islands, forming the Apostatic Union. More specifically, we're on the Oniric Isles, an archipelago at the very southern edge of Union territory, where its grip is loosest, and cultists are trying to revive the old ways for the sake of their own survival. It makes for a wonderfully dark and alien vibe. The sky glows red with an organic-looking pseudo-star. Villagers farm giant psychoactive mushrooms which supposedly grant temporary clairvoyance, and human sacrifice to blood gods is in living memory. It's not totally unfamiliar. You will be in European-looking towns and castles, some gothic cathedrals to the west, and steampunkish industrial areas to the east. But on the whole, it exudes that sort of beautifully weird and evil feeling you get from games like the original Fallout, or even Pathologic. The amount of stuff you can see off in the distance is staggering. It really gets you excited to explore the world, and adds lots of payoff when you finally get to places you've been seeing glimpses of for half the game. The late 90s console game aesthetic is vibrant and striking, and the music is also generally fantastic. Although there aren't quite enough tracks, and the long gaps between loops of a single track are awkward. The audioscape in general can be just a little bit too barren for its own good sometimes. The silence is great for immersion most of the time, and I like the choice to forego voice acting for almost the entire game, but things like some crowd noise in the pubs or far-off creature sounds out in the wilderness would go a long way. I love the world building in this game. It's such an intriguing universe to learn about, and it has so much tangible history to really sink your teeth into. The Apostatic Union, in particular, is a really neat faction. They are, in attitude and aesthetic, religious fanatics, always on about repentance through suffering, and talking about reason and logic as if they were holy virtues. But they're not just atheistic, they're anti-theistic, fancying themselves as above that sort of backward savagery that needs to be rooted out by force. Your first quest giver is a woman sealed in a floating Iron Maiden that tortures her perpetually to keep her mind off of heresy. And her squad of militant, anti-occult soldiers are literally called an Inquisition. It's very Catholic, but a Catholicism without God. They've retained all the worst aspects of a theocratic society, and rejected the central object which gives people faith in their leaders and institutions in such a society. Anyone outside the Union's core cities is poor, starving, and on the brink of spilling their blood for the blood gods just to survive. At least when the rot god Pageth demands a tax, he keeps his end of the bargain. The Union reminds me a good bit of the NCR circa New Vegas, with how it reflects modern, liberal democratic society in decay. I especially like one Inquisition soldier I found out on the field, stomping out cultists, who says, "I don't blame these people for turning to god worship. I don't blame them, but I do punish them." The political commentary is hard to miss, being a game by an English lead developer, and a lead writer who spent time working in America. God save the king, and God bless the USA. For the Union to absolve you of whatever crime you've committed, per your chosen backstory, you're tasked with hunting down a famous-turned-infamous mercenary leader, Velikalos of the Dark Star Mercenaries, who's got some secretive plans in the works. Vela is this wonderfully fleshed out ideologue, the type of antagonist that only shows up for a precious few minutes of the game, but is so thoroughly the center of its storytelling that you could almost call it a character study. Her personal and political motivations intertwine really nicely. She feels like a real person, not just a symbol of her ideology or a bundle of traumas to be unpacked. It's hard to really get into her character without veering into spoiler talk, but suffice to say that she has compelling motives that make her very engaging to chase after. You learn about her by tracking down 3 of her former mercenary comrades over the course of the game, and each of them has their own complex relationship and history with her, and their own view of her big plans. Finding them, of course, leads you through the 3 main islands that make up the game's major areas, and easily the best of the 3 is the Clockwork Kingdom. The tutorial area, Pwyll, is solid, if a bit long in the tooth, and the first real area, Hallowshire, is good and meaty. But this place is where the real heavy-hitting stuff is. The people here have built themselves a mechanical monarch that manages society for them, an attempt at creating a truly new society unlike the Union, who they call the defeatist entity, and their king is clearly breaking down. It won't give people food, but it will give them extravagant luxuries that no one even has the money to buy from them. It's been winter in this region for half a year because the king wills it, and no one can grow any crops. You can submit a request for medicine today, and only get your rejection letter 6 months after you're dead. All the while, the bureaucrats in charge of carrying out its will pretend nothing is wrong. On top of that, things are disappearing, and everyone's slowly forgetting. There's a homeless person down in the slums with a key to a house they swear they own, but can't remember where, and no one else knows either. People wake up one day and find that there's an extra bed in their home, and they don't remember whose it is. There's a notice board in the middle of town covered in flyers looking for people who've gone missing. But a lot of them don't even have the name of the person they're looking for, because they can't remember. Just an acknowledgement that it feels like someone used to be here who isn't anymore. And it's here that the absolute best quest in the game, Missing Persons, starts. I won't spoil it for you, it's something you have to experience for yourself, but I'll say that it made me genuinely sad and angry. It's such a wonderfully bittersweet story with a very human heart to it. It's up there with the best stuff in any of the RPGs I've named in this video, and I mean that 100% sincerely. Not only that, but it ties in with the Clockwork King quest excellently, in that sort of way where you go, there's no way there's dialogue options for this. These 2 quests can't actually interact like that, but they do. The work was put in to make the consequences of the best side quest in the game matter at least a little bit for the other best side quest in the game. I want to shout out lead writer E.O. Brindle by name. She deserves an award for what she's accomplished here. The Clockwork Kingdom is such a complex web of inspirations. It's part Soviet, part American, part Silicon Valley, part supernatural mystery with splashes of SCP and political thriller. It's so cool, and it doesn't ease up on the oppressive atmosphere for even a second. It's utterly uncompromising. Unfortunately, I can't say the same for the Endless Realm, the last major area I haven't mentioned yet. The setup is nice. The people here all got turned into immortal zombies when their king made a Faustian bargain for immortality hundreds of years ago, and they have this lingering guilt over the years they spent eating sentient beings to survive. They kinda all wish they could die, only now that they can't anymore. Most of these people have been alive since before the world rend, and these aren't typical zombies. They can't create more of themselves, not without tremendous effort anyway, and most wouldn't choose to even if they could. But it's just a little too dull. There's not many quests here, and they're too basic and short. I spent the whole game getting hype over this crazy dragon I saw flying around in the sky from the other islands, and when I finally met it here, it gave me a boring fetch quest to get it 3 whatevers and flew off again. The main quest NPC you're looking for here is kinda disappointing too. She's got the least going on of any of the major characters, in my opinion. The scale suffers most in this region too. There's supposedly thousands of Endless living in these mausoleums, lore-wise, but you go inside them and they're like 3 rooms and a treasure chest. If I had to narrow it down, it's that the moral dilemma type quests here are the sort I really don't enjoy. That is, the no good options type of quest. You know the Civil War in Skyrim? The one that's basically the biggest thing in the game right next to the main quest, but no one does it? When the 2 factions I'm offered both exclusively suck, I'm not going to do the type of complex ideological dance that I engage with in, say, New Vegas. I'm not going to have debates online about which faction or ending is the best, informed by my real-life socio-political beliefs. I'm just not going to do the quest, unless it's mandatory. If I do end up doing it, I'll just pick whatever vaguely aligns with choices I've made in the past, which is not the sort of mentality you want to engender, I don't think. The Endless Realm is the worst for this sort of thing, but there's a quest early on in Hallowshire that's really bad in this regard too. You go up to a castle, find out there's a curse on the place, and you can either submit a guy to eternal torture to suppress it, or you can put him out of his misery and there'll be a plague in a very small, nearby, immediate area that kills one NPC. It's the outline of a real dilemma, but with none of the substance. It's like a trolley problem where both sides of the track have the same number of people. The choice is arbitrary. I might as well flip a coin. I have no reason to prefer one side over the other. It doesn't help that this is really just some random thing off to the side. It doesn't impact any other part of the world. You do it and then you leave. There's a bit too little consequence on the world for quests in general, but ones like this are especially bad in that regard. It's really the platonic ideal of this type of bad quest, and thankfully these no-good options quests aren't very common. You get a similar quest at the climax of the ostensible tutorial area, and it's much better, in spite of having a similar rock-and-a-hard-place dynamic. If you play this game, do Pwyll, then Hallowshire, then Endless Realm, then Clockwork Kingdom. It'll save the best for last, and sandwich the weakest stories in the game in between the really good stuff. Maybe the highest compliment I can pay Dread Delusion is that its story and themes gave me high expectations that it actually managed to meet. I can't spoil it too much in good conscience, not for a game I recommend specifically on the basis of its story, but it has core ideas and it sticks to them. There was a pivoting point, right where I really started to piece together what Vela was after and how she was trying to achieve it, that I thought, this is either going to be really good, or it's going to break my heart. And it was the former. It avoids obnoxious thematic cliches common to the genre, and has the guts to give the player explicitly bad outcomes if they make bad decisions that the themes don't support. It doesn't look kindly on cruelty or cowardice, and it does have firm ideas for what would make the world a better place. Once again, if you're a gay communist, I highly recommend Dread Delusion. Let's leave it at that. But all of this is just story and world building. What about RPG gameplay? What about my dice rolls, my stats, my buffs and debuffs? We've discussed how well the game delivers on a world and story which feels like a real follow-up to its inspirations, so how does the gameplay compare to those old games? Well, oh boy. I will be nice up front and say that the map is fun to explore. This isn't a situation where I was dreading leaving the towns and NPCs behind to go out and run through the fields. There's always something just over the horizon to travel toward, and lots of stuff sprinkled along the way to sidetrack you. And thank God, there are no map markers, or arrows, or HUD elements telling you where to go and ruining the exploration. Fast travel is also relatively limited, which is nice. You pick up a Go Home spell early on, which will teleport you back to your most recent checkpoint, as well as a Speed Boost spell, reminiscent of the Boots of Blinding Speed from Morrowind. But these are double-edged enough swords to not invalidate good old dirt road travel. There are a few two-way teleporters dotted around the world, but they all have to be unlocked first, and they're only in hub areas. Any surrounding wilderness you want to explore, you have to explore yourself. And pretty much every teleporter is locked behind some kind of side quest or NPC interaction. It's very possible to miss a lot of them for most of the game unless you're particularly thorough. I quite like how the world is laid out and how you get around it. All in all, the game is fun. I always felt the compulsion to wander and discover. But Dread Delusion is mechanically bare bones to an almost comical degree. The game features only 4 stats, the corest of the core, equivalent to strength, dexterity, intelligence, and charisma. Each governs exactly 2 skills, for a total of 8, most of which are passive things like movement speed or damage resistance. There's magic, but it's all pre-baked spells with no requirements and no branching element types or anything like that. If you have enough mana to cast a spell, you can cast it, though the damage-dealing ones do scale off your spellcasting stat. There's no difference between magic damage and physical damage. Firing a magic missile from your spellbook is mechanically identical to firing an arrow from a bow, aside from what extremely plentiful resource it costs. Speech checks are a raw pass or fail based on a single stat, charm, and nothing else. Leveling up isn't done through experience points or skill increases, but pickups doled out in chunks as quest or exploration rewards, comparable to Zelda's heart pieces. If there's a traditional mechanical RPG thing you associate with the genre, it probably isn't here. I don't mean to say that Dread Delusion's gameplay is bad because it doesn't have some feature from some other game that I expected. I mean to say that its gameplay is bad because it doesn't have features. It's simplistic and unchallenging to the point of becoming boring and unimmersive. If this quote from developer Lovely Hellplace's website is to be believed, a core goal of the game was streamlining, a reduction in repetition and micromanaging, and a focus in on the good stuff, like exploration and storytelling. This isn't a regressive attempt at capturing the old and simplistic, it's a real effort at advancing the genre. It's just unfortunate that it accomplished exactly the opposite of its goals. Enemy encounters aren't less repetitive, they're now meaningless to the point of being exclusively repetitive. Even the weakest, most useless fight against a bug on the side of the road in Morrowind contributed some fraction of a percentage of a level up, whereas enemies in Dread Delusion might as well not even be there most of the time. The rewards for killing them are meager and never contribute to level ups. Enemy AI can only either walk at you in a straight line or shoot a projectile at where you're standing, and enemy speed and aggro range are so low as to allow you to sprint past everything with no consequence. The problem isn't that the game is too easy, although it is. It's that an excess of good faith is required from the player to care enough to engage with its gameplay systems, the thing that makes up the bulk of its runtime. The second you let yourself understand that none of these systems are necessary for you to get by, the illusion shatters. You can't incentivize exploration if exploration almost never results in anything meaningful, like a cool new piece of equipment or a mechanically engaging fight. Most of the time, all I got for my troubles was a ring with some minor stat buff that I'd throw in the pile and never look at again. Or a small chunk of a level up toward one more point in a boring stat that barely comes into play, like the world's worst version of Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. It's especially bad for anything combat related, because I can compensate for any combat deficiency by holding the S key and left clicking enough times. Note that the Might stat only increases health, attack, and defense, making it by far the worst stat to max. Probably the best rewards, at least for my build, were spells, but a lot of these are only useful on a magic build, and a lot of them just aren't useful at all. There's also not that many, so they're doled out very few and far between across the game world. Sometimes the combat is engaging, when I'm in a small room with multiple enemies. But that's a rare occasion, and even then, that's me acting in good faith and playing the challenge as intended, rather than just walking back out the door to funnel the enemies and lobbing projectiles while backpedaling. Even worse, this is one of those no consequences for dying type games, as in all dying does is send you to a respawn point with no loss of money, items, experience, or progress of any real kind, meaning the only punishment for mistakes is having to walk back to where you were. At the very least, I can say this system enables the game to perpetually autosave, meaning any narrative choices you make are permanent and preventing save scumming. The latter doesn't really matter, given how easy the game is, but the former is very nice for forcing you to take your dialogue options seriously. And I do appreciate, for immersive purposes, a diegetic death system. But I don't think that necessitated having zero consequences for death. Aside from a no death run achievement, but who cares? Clearly we understand the value of consequence with regard to story. I don't know why we don't do the same for gameplay. I also have no idea why I'd put points into a stat that increases health when enemies can't land a hit on me anyway. And even if they do, I effectively have infinite potions. Or why I'd spend my money in materials on player housing just to have a bed a stone's throw away from an inn that charges me pennies. And I don't know why I'd replay this entire 30+ hour game to make different choices when my build will feel practically identical all the way through. But the real victim of the streamlining is immersion. Stats and complexity in RPGs don't exist just for fun, although I do take serious umbrage with the idea that those old games had bad gameplay anyway, or so that elitist jerks like me can feel superior about how smart we are. They exist for simulation purposes. D&D has a strength stat, not just to determine how much damage your Orc Barbarian does in combat. It's also there so that your Orc Barbarian can affect the world in the way an Orc Barbarian would. If Grug the Smasher couldn't get to a treasure chest because a flimsy wooden door was blocking his way, and there was no rule for how much strength is required to break a wooden door, then Bob the real-life guy who's playing him is going to take his character sheet and go home, because the game is not facilitating the role-playing experience he's looking for. He doesn't feel like Grug the Smasher, because Grug the Smasher can only exist in a world where smashing exists. Games like Deus Ex are arguably a better encapsulation of the RPG ethos than even Morrowind or Baldur's Gate, being so simulationist that they become even more immersive. Huh, I guess that's why they're called that. J.C. Denton's world doesn't have stat points assigned to every object just for the sake of opulence. It has them so that doors break when shot with a rocket launcher, as doors in real life do. Dread Delusion does have some breakable doors, but only when it says so. And only ever for a minor reward, like a few coins or a potion. Maybe a piece of upgrade material. You can't get creative and throw an explosive at a door to blow it up. You can't trick an enemy that's stronger than you into ramming the door down. It's pass or fail, based on your stats, and that's it. Putting points into strength shouldn't feel the same as putting points into dex. But it does, because all either enables me to do is open different types of door. Or oftentimes the same door, since breakable doors can usually be lockpicked anyway. This lack of immersive quality even bleeds into the otherwise nice aesthetic of the game, with pickups being represented by floating, rotating object models. That sort of thing looks fine in an arcadey action shooter like Quake, but sticks out like a sore thumb in what's meant to be an immersive, experiential RPG. Half-Life, a game that shares more in common with the aforementioned Quake than it does with Stalker, has objects sit on the ground like objects, rather than video game power-ups. Even Ultima Underworld had enemy corpses and items sitting on the floor in 1992. Enemies poofing into smoke on death and leaving behind a floating knife, rather than a body which I can loot to obtain a knife, wasn't the right move for a game like this. I'm not entirely sure why this decision was even made. It could be a necessary bit of clarity given the game's PS1 visual style, or just a bit of misplaced nostalgia that's not quite accurate to its source, but the result is the same, and it leads to a lack of environmental storytelling, because if an object isn't screaming out for your attention, it isn't important. Yeah, making objects both blend into their environment and be obvious as to their usefulness is hard. But that's the kind of thing you sign up for when you choose to make a game of this type.
There wasn't anything in your room. Only a bed and a small desk. It looked like a prison cell.
It's similarly disappointing how cartoonish the sound effects are. And that you can't see the player character in any way, not even their hands. These are small but important elements to making the player feel like they're in a world, and they're poorly done here. Dread Delusion is not simulationist, no. And where it tries, like the extremely superficial and pointless faction system, it fails, which dampens the immersion a lot. It doesn't feel right that such a decaying, hostile-seeming environment, full of cultists and curses and plague, is so frictionless. The store page boasts that there are always means to avoid combat, but the game never presents anything threatening enough to make that a tempting option. I shouldn't be able to walk into the corrupted lands, quarantined off from the rest of the Clockwork Kingdom for how dangerous it is, and have zero difficulty getting around. Not only that, but the conspicuously placed Elden Ring shortcuts back to the mainland dampen the believability of that quarantine. Right, so the Clockwork King has ordered no one enters or exits this place except geared up plague soldiers armed with flamethrowers, who are constantly testing themselves for signs of infection. They have to burn their clothes when they leave, and they're stuck in their houses for a week or whatever before they're allowed out in public again, just to be sure. But I throw down a drawbridge at the back exit and no one's guarding it or puts it back up by the time I come back. And in the safer areas, you're telling me no one who lives in this town ever uses this elevator? It's just inactive until I round back and turn it on myself? Come on. No one in Pwyll has any need for quick access to Hallowshire, where there's a big city that all the trade goes through? There's a quest early on to follow this shady figure to their secret lair, yet I can walk right in and all he does is get slightly annoyed if I walk up and try to talk to him, even though there is a light stealth system? Oblivion might have made critical NPCs immortal, but I think literally only 3 NPCs in Dread Delusion can be both spoken to and fought. Too much convenience, too little willingness to say no to a player who wants easy access to things, too many things built explicitly for the player and not for the world. And for all this streamlining, we really haven't cut out much busy work. If I am taking the game seriously and using my equipment for its intended purpose, then I'll be ducking in and out of my menu constantly to equip my 2 different lockpicking charms. Not to mention my lockpicking hat whenever I find a locked door. I'll be switching my spellcasting hat out for my charm boosting hat whenever I see an NPC who might have a speech check for me, then back again after. I'll be putting on my barter boosting ring whenever I have to buy or sell something. I'll be putting on my agility robes when it's time to run across the overworld, and I'll be switching them out for my spellcasting robes if I have something to kill. A lot of these could have been permanent upgrade trinkets that go on my character's keychain, rather than equipable items, if streamlining was the goal. And why is lockpicking a dice roll? Almost nothing else in this game is up to chance, but you just had to make it really annoying to run out of lockpicks and have to run all the way back to town to grab more? Really now, the number of lockpicks I can hold is based on my lockpick skill? What, this game has no carry weight system? No max inventory capacity for potions or ingredients or throwing weapons? But suddenly we need a limit on how many lockpicks I can carry? I can run around Morrowind all day with 40 lockpicks in my bag, and they each have 25 uses. But the streamlined game hard caps that? No, we haven't streamlined out the busy work, we've just streamlined out the fun. The traditional RPGs of the past were not that difficult. They weren't even really that complicated, if you were willing to look up a little build advice online. This aversion to traditional RPG mechanics, as if they were a needless, boring barrier to good storytelling and not a key part of it, as well as fun in their own right, is deeply misguided. I don't even need some complex game design argument for this. Just look at some of the most popular games of this century. Skyrim, Diablo 2, Witcher 3, Elden Ring, Baldur's Gate 3. Not exactly Pathfinder levels of complexity in any of them, but still leagues more to them than Delusion, mechanically speaking, anyway. And the normies clearly don't find that overwhelming or repetitive. Elden Ring specifically proves difficulty isn't a barrier either. Mechanics are fun, and mechanics are storytelling, and the story Delusion's mechanics tell runs in contrast with its harsh, alien, dying world, costing investment in both, and without any fun. If I were more of a hack fraud than I am, I would title this video something like, The Two Sides of Delusion. I'd conclude that the story was mostly good, but the gameplay was mostly bad, and that you should play it if that's okay with you. I might say it's a small indie project, so its flaws are probably the result of limited time and budget, which is definitely true to some extent. I divided the video in sections like this, specifically because it made things easier for me. The whole thing kinda came out as a mess. I don't know how much sense any of this makes. But I could have taken the easier way out if I really wanted a tidier piece of content. There are easy conclusions here that hardly anyone could disagree with. But that's not how I feel about it. I feel like there's something that unifies Delusion into a coherent whole, and that's ambition. So, the game runs kinda poorly. We've gotten a few patches now, and I still drop down as low as the 40s in terms of frame rate sometimes. Maybe even lower. Doesn't really seem sensible for a game of this intentionally low fidelity, does it? You might conclude it's a result of inexperience on the part of the programmers, or what have you. But at a certain point, I realized something. This game doesn't have loading screens. Well, it does when you first load up your file. But beyond that, the open world is completely seamless, including towns, dungeons, and transitions between entire regions. Huh. Why is that? It seems like it's costing a lot in terms of performance, if I'm guessing correctly. And the game certainly grinds to a halt whenever you teleport between areas regardless. I suppose it's a nice immersive element, but I doubt it would have hurt too much to have loading screens between regions. Why do it like this? Toward the end of the game, right as you're about to reach the climax, you unlock an airship. I knew it was in the game, I'd seen it in the trailers, but only when I actually got my hands on it did I realize the implications. You can fly anywhere in the entire overworld, seamlessly, and hop off your airship anytime you want. No loading at all. Oh, it'll stutter like a motherfucker. The game is not having an easy time doing what it's doing. And it's not even like there's really a point. I'd already done every side quest I could before getting here. Even if I hadn't, you can make travel across long distances pretty quick, if you're diligent about unlocking fast travel points. It wouldn't take long to polish off what remains without this inclusion. The final area is on an island separate from all the others, but it didn't have to be. There's a few small secret islands where you can pick up some endgame items and finish up one last side quest, but those could have been placed anywhere. There are actually a few unimplemented features in the full release at time of writing, like one of the endgame weapon paths. It's not like there was all this extra time to just make something cool to throw in. There's no necessary reason for this airship segment. It almost exclusively makes the game worse by slowing it down and asking you to do a bunch of busy work right before the finale, on top of the ever-present performance issues. Maybe it would have been a little disappointing for a game about sky islands, where the primary means of transport is airship, to not have a flyable airship in it somewhere. But this implementation isn't exactly not disappointing. Certainly not good enough to warrant this high a cost. But it's kinda cool, right? It's kinda crazy. Seemingly, this massive sacrifice in performance that, by all means, was not worth it, was made because the developer had a weird, ambitious, out there idea that they pursued at all costs. Probably without the experience necessary to get it done even in the best of circumstances, let alone under time and budget constraints. Even if my guess is wrong, and the performance problems are all on my end, which I don't think is the case, going by the Steam forums and patch notes, it still wasn't a sensible choice to make. But that's kind of the whole game, isn't it? Isn't it that same disregard for sense or consequence which leads a team this small to even try making a game of this kind? Don't you kind of have to be an insane person to have so few credentials, and try to make a successor to some of the best games ever made? Wouldn't it have been more down-to-earth to make something smaller scale? A hub-based game akin to Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines or Deus Ex or even Disco Elysium, rather than a true open world? Isn't it kind of bold to be openly inspired by those games, and then reject every mechanical idea they hold to? To want to make something new so badly that you'll slash away the old so recklessly? Maybe ambition isn't the right term. Maybe it's just that, a desire for something new, a lack of contentment with the way things are, and a compulsion to change them, consequences be damned. Those quests I mentioned, the no-good options ones, maybe those kind of work when I look at them this way. Maybe they convey the idea that the world of Dread Delusion needs a change more radical than little adjustments here or there. Sometimes you do have to make a choice you're not happy with, while holding out for a bigger, better solution later down the line. Dread Delusion kind of mirrors its own antagonist, ultimately doing the right thing but sacrificing too much of itself in the process. That doesn't make its goals wrong or the results bad, it just means it might be up to someone else to take the opportunity it's created. But in the meantime, it's something well worth experiencing in its own right. I'm glad that of all the banger new indie games that released right around the same time as this one, that I picked the weird, fucked up, kinda bad one that made me feel a lot. It's a really beautiful game. It's gonna stick with me for a long time. I can't believe how hard it hit me just to hear the music again a couple weeks after finishing it. I can tell this game is only gonna grow on me more and more as time passes. Check it out, you won't regret it. Especially if you're a gay communist.